Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to this year's virtual JEDI Talks series. My name is Linda Marziallo, and I am currently AIA Tennessee's president-elect and chair of our statewide JEDI committee. This committee was formed a little over a year ago with the goal of making our profession more equitable, inclusive, and diverse, through acknowledging, listening, learning, and acting to bring about change that will lead to more diversity in our profession and more equitable opportunities for all. Our committee is made up of representatives from across the state, AIA Tennessee, the 4 local components of Chattanooga, Knoxville, Memphis, and Middle Tennessee, as well as representatives from Noma Nash and Noma Memphis. If you are interested in joining this committee, we would love to have you. Please contact Ashley, Molly, or me. Today, we begin the 2nd annual October JEDI Talks. The program will run virtually today, tomorrow, and Thursday from 11 a.m. Central Standard Time to 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. So it's an hour and a half each day. This year's program is titled Steps Toward Inclusion, and it will build upon the discussion from last year's JEDI program, and it will look at the strides that we've made over the past year in ascending actions toward equity and inclusion. These will be presented through the lenses of education and our professional workplace. Introducing the series and speaking today will be Ingrid Cochkren. Along with being today's speaker, Ingrid will facilitate all 3 days of the program and the Q&A sessions that will follow. Ingrid Cochkren is currently a professor at Tennessee State University and a stress and trauma expert. She specializes in collective trauma, historical trauma, and trauma-informed policies and practices. Ingrid has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Tennessee State University and a Master's of Education from Vanderbilt's Peabody College. She led last year's 2020 October JEDI Talks for us, and we are delighted to have her back again this year. Thank you, Ingrid. Please join me in giving her a big welcome. And Ingrid, at this point, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Linda. And thanks for inviting me back to talk about this important topic again. Like Linda said, this is going to be a series that follows up on the first series that we had last year. And so today we really will kind of recap the discussion from last year as a way to begin our discussions when we look at both the academic and the workplaces as we move forward. So one thing about last year when I was doing research for the first session, and one one sentence that really stood out to me was the legacy of exclusion in the field of architecture. I really resonated with this wording, mainly because in my work, I'm mostly a historical trauma consultant. And so, and most of my work in that sphere is really about legacy and how much history really impacts the things that we are going through today. So often we try to kind of jump in and solve a problem without knowing the history, without taking or acknowledging the history for as impactful as it is. And then that leads us to kind of focusing on symptoms, like the fact that people of color and women are underrepresented in the field of architecture, that they have less opportunities to enter the field because of education, because of their home life, because of poverty, that they have less opportunities for employment, especially while they're still getting their education, promotion, less opportunity for leadership positions. And we see those as symptoms that we need to address, but really we have to reflect and address root cause. And root causes will help us to first see those symptoms in a different light and think through how we can really address those in a meaningful way. In my consulting experience, those who reach out to me focusing on DEI work, they really want to skip over root cause and kind of jump into work on symptoms. And what I do is I help people to pull back and say, these are the root causes. This is what you really need to work on. And this is the hard work. So often people will, develop committees and they will put a lot of money towards DEI work and then don't get the results that they want. Even if they were to change their hiring practices and bring more people in, then they might not be able to retain those people. And we really what we want to talk about is how if we look at root causes, then that makes our work more effective in the DEI sphere. And for this issue, the issue of DEI, the root cause is trauma and stress. And we will look at the root causes, kind of delve into trauma and stress as it pertains to our nation, and how that bleeds into the field of architecture, just like any other field. However, architecture does have a particularly, in-depth legacy of exclusion, which is supported by the research that shows it is one of the industries that is more than 90% white. And so when we look at architecture and all the other industries in America, we have to look at our American history. And so today we're going to talk about DEI and architecture as a whole. Our next module will focus on academic programs, and then we'll finish up with looking at DEI within the workplace, and we'll have a spotlight on Moody Nolan. So first thing, when we think about root cause, our DEI work is centered around identity. There has been a lot of research into identity and identity development. It is often centered around people of color. So today I want to examine white identity. And so Dr. Janet Helms in the 70s, she came up with this white identity development model that I resonate with because it really does help me to get our conversation started, to kind of get some foundational things out of the way before we move forward. When we are talking about issues of race, which can be very triggering and distressful conversations, and I want to always begin with some basics. So race is a social construct that develops over time. And when we look at how the different races interact with racial identity, there are some very distinct differences. And Dr. Janet Helms does a great job of capturing what white racial identity is and how it develops. she often called white racial identity the invisible identity. And this is based on the research that shows that when we look at race, about 65 to 70% of African Americans believe that race is integral to their personality. More than half of Latino individuals, Middle Eastern, Asian also feel as though race is critical to their identity. But when we ask white people, is race critical to their identity, it plummets to about 11%. And so what does that mean? It means that when we think about how race develops over time and how people internalize their race, that white people really stand behind colorblindness, that race doesn't matter, that they don't see race. And Dr. Janet Helms does a great job of looking at what this looks like when it comes to identity development overall. Her stages are hierarchical, but they're not based on age, and not everybody gets through all stages. So the first stage is contact. This is colorblindness. This is what we have been taught in schools since about the late 60s into the 70s in early childhood education is colorblindness. Also during contact, people can discuss and acknowledge that race is a problem in America. But at this stage, there is this understanding that color doesn't matter, that our differences are based mainly on our morals and our character, and not so much our skin color. People can stay in this stage their entire lives. However, in order to matriculate to the next stage, which is disintegration, white people have to experience some type of racialized event that causes guilt and shame. Now, most white people will experience a racialized event in their lives, but that doesn't mean that it will cause guilt and shame. It is the reaction that moves one to the next stage in identity. This often happens, if it happens, in late adolescence, early adulthood, high school age, early college years, where they have some type of racialized experience that makes them feel shameful or guilty. They could be a bystander and see a person of color experiencing some type of racialized event and may feel guilt or shame because they didn't intervene. They may be the perpetrator of a microaggression or a racist event that they feel guilt and shame. The next stage is reintegration. Often, in America, this is going to be one of the most common stages. And so this is the blame the victim stage. And so this is when you say these groups are having a hard time because they make bad decisions. They should get jobs, they should raise their children differently, they should go to different schools, they should live in different neighborhoods. Often when we talk about issues of white privilege or advantage, it is framed in that white people have privileges because they deserve them, and not because they are given or expected. Another stage that's extremely common is pseudo-independence. So this is recognizing that racism exists, that it is systemic in nature, and that it is causing disparities within our society, but then also expecting people of color to bear the responsibility of addressing it. So if we acknowledge that racism does exist, our history shows us that this is a systemic issue that has been created in the past by white society. So it would not be realistic to believe that those who are not in power would be able to change that system. And so, but pseudo-independence is very common in white identity stages and is where white people are dependent on people of color to determine what is racist, how they cannot be racist or be biased, and also expect people of color to be able to change the systems that are impacting their community. And then we have immersion, which has become kind of a buzzword lately. This translates to what we call anti-racism. And so this is very widely accepted today, which I'm sure Dr. Helms would think that that's very interesting, because this, like I said, this theory was brought about in the mid-70s. And so anti-racism is really that someone accepts white identity and is pushing against racism actively in their workplaces, in their lives, in the way they raise their children. And then our last stage is autonomy, which is the pursuit of social justice, which means white individuals who are working in social justice space to ensure equity and diversity and inclusion in our world, in our country. So this is a good time to reflect on where you are in this identity model. And any of you brave souls who wants to share where you think you are, you can type it in the chat. Also, some basics before we get started in our in-depth conversation is first, what is race? In America, we live in a very racialized, polarized society. And we are, it is so embedded in our culture that we believe in the concept of genetic race, that there is something very different about skin color and eye color and hair texture and things of this nature that we attribute to not just culture, but also, power and who has civilization and who doesn't, who has history and who doesn't. And also which one is better than the other. So this is not something that just happened by chance. Like it wasn't that people just observed and said, these are the different races and we've assigned these sort of social and political and economic characteristics based on skin color. This was something that happened in the 1700s, late 1600s, where European white academic elites classified people by races and then put those classifications in textbooks, especially medical textbooks specifically. And this was around the beginnings of our talks of evolution as well. So these manuscripts, the latest one was probably in the 1800s, which was written by an underling of Darwin. And he says that there's three categories of people, that there are the civilized, the semi-civilized, and the savage. And this was widely accepted at the time. Like I said, it was in textbooks, so people were learning this in schools, especially in medical schools. And what he said was that civilized were the European nations and those of European descent. Semi-civilized were Asian nations, especially at the time, the Chinese. And then the savages were African nations and indigenous nations. And along with those different categories was the understanding that the civilized were able to have history, they had language, they were able to live in a way that was more moral than the other groups. And then the semi-civilized were savages in some aspects, but still had civilization and were able to have things like commerce and to trade. They were able to trade with the Europeans. And then the savages, which were the African nations and the indigenous nations, had no history, had no language, had no civilization or structure to their society. This we know to not be the truth for today's standards. We're very clear on African civilization as well as indigenous civilization, their rules for their society and their contributions. However, at the time, that was considered textbook knowledge and was taught in classrooms in formal education. This created our belief today that there is a genetic race, that race makes us very different from each other, when it's actually the environments that we live in that make us different from each other. And genetically, there's more genetic diversity within races than between races. And so if we understand that race is a social construct, then we'll move into what we call critical race theory. I've been teaching about critical race theory for quite some time. It's interesting to me that it's so buzzy right now, but it is not being taught in K through 12 schools just to bust any myths around critical race theory. It is actually a legal theory that is focused on our legal system here in America. Also, a theory that was brought about in the 70s that really said that our legal system and other systems are inherently racist because they were built to marginalize people of color and to hoard power and social and political advantage for one group. The basic tenets of critical race theory: first, white supremacy is deeply embedded within our society and that it is permanent. Second, that racism is institutional, not individual. Third, that the power structure that we have here in this country was meant to marginalize people of color, that it was not by chance or by mistake, but that it was on purpose. And then lastly, like I just talked about, race is a social construct that has been used as a tool to stratify power. This is controversial today only because I think people don't want their children to be impacted by racial identity. And so children of color, they are being racially socialized and develop their racial identity around their skin color. They're told how to act out in public, how to interact with the police. They're told that they have to work harder because they're Black or brown. They're told that they have to talk white and dress white and act white to be successful, whereas white children do not go through as much racial socialization because, again, they're considered an invisible racial identity. They are more likely to be taught colorblindness, despite the fact that racism is obviously impacting our society. And so they believe that the differences among us are not because of racism, systemic, or because of our history, but because people of color just tend to make more bad choices. And so if we, a lot of the pushback on critical race theory is about the impact that it would have on children's identity if we taught real history in school. And so I wanted to set the stage with these two ideas around race and racial identity, and then, of course, critical race theory, because as we move forward, we want to have kind of a shared understanding that there is no actual real race, genetic race, and that environmental issues are the drivers for the differences among us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those environmental issues are and what they do. Let's see. So these definitions are pretty straightforward, but I want to introduce the concept of institutional racism and how we have systems of oppression that impact racial groups and give advantage to others. largely what this is driven by is inequity. And so institutional racism is all about inequity. And we often think about equality and equity as kind of the same thing. And this is something that is critical as we move forward in our discussion of what does it mean to address these issues in a real way in the field of architecture. It's going to look like being equitable in our practices. Being equitable means that we are righting past wrongs. And this often is where our efforts are thwarted. So we'll say that, yes, we want to address these issues of pipeline and access and poverty and education, but we are often unwilling to do the things that will make that happen. And that's what equity is. So are we willing to pay people of color more? We get stuck on equality, where we want to pay, everybody has the same, everybody gets the same piece of pie. But if we were to focus on equity, we would say that people who have been long underserved would get more as a way to address past wrongs. We would say that people of color would be more likely to be hired, that we would create pathways for that to happen, that they would get more support than others. This is something that came up recently in another industry with Black farmers. Black farmers have been consistently underserved since the end of slavery, starting with sharecropping, when they were engaging in unpaid labor just to be able to have housing. That long history means that Black farmers are owed reparations for their poor treatment in the past. And the Biden administration recently tried to address that with giving priority to Black farmers for loans. That was quickly ended because lawsuits came in from white farmers that said that that was discrimination. And so this is what equity looks like. Equity looks like people of color getting more today. It looks like having more of an advantage today. And this is often what stops us from being able to move forward, because we've kind of declared mission accomplished on racism and are pushing for equality. And so equity is about people getting what they need. And when you have hundreds of years of being behind, what you need is the ability to grow generational wealth. You need the ability to have sustainability. You need the ability to have access. And if we're doing it in an equitable way, then that means that it's not equal, that you actually will have more than those who have everything they need presently. Equity is an issue for people of color, for women, and for people who have been living with generational poverty of all races. And so this kind of brings me back to our discussion about trauma, root causes. This system of institutional racism has traumatized people of color in this country. And trauma, we think, is very straightforward. You have a traumatic event, you may have PTSD. PTSD looks like not being able to sleep at night, changes to your nervous system, definitely changing to your patterns of eating, depression, anxiety, all stress-related symptoms that we know of and we think about with soldiers or people who have been in a car wreck or have experienced extreme violence. But however, PTSD is more than that. And also it can be passed along through generations. And so we have our initial understanding of trauma, which is visualized here in the smaller pyramid that is saying people who experience a traumatic experience, especially if they happen younger in life, they have changes to the brain, which is also known as neurodevelopmental disruption. This type of disruption then leads to social, emotional, and cognitive problems. So it looks like children who aren't able to pay attention in school, children who have ADHD diagnosis, or bad physical behavior in school, children who are depressed or anxious. Also cognitive impairment, children who don't perform well academically, children with lower IQ. All of these impairments will then lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. Drinking, smoking, early sex, high school dropout, lack of educational attainment, any health risk behavior that people engage in. That, of course, leads to disability, disease, social problems, and ultimately early death. And so there was a study done in the 90s called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study that explored trauma in childhood and found that those who experience high levels of adversity in their childhood were experiencing early death on average of 20 years off of their lifespan. So people passing away in their 60s. And so this is interesting because before we thought about childhood adversity as being a social problem, you might be more likely to go to jail, but early death was mostly chronic disease. So diabetes, heart disease, cancer. And so this study led to other studies, and then we began to study, the stress and trauma of racism. And then we found that people who were of darker skin were more likely to experience more adversity. So again, the driver for early death. And when we look at what that looks like in real life, you have those who have experienced the most historical trauma and present day trauma as being African Americans and Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous people experiencing genocide, African Americans experiencing chattel slavery, and all the different stages since then. So it's not like trauma and oppression ended for Indigenous people after all land was stolen. It's not like after slavery ended, Black people, African Americans didn't experience any more stress or trauma. But those two groups have the highest level of historical trauma in our country, and they have a life expectancy that is about 6 years less than the rest of our population, especially African American men who have a life expectancy of just 70 years. And so if we look at that from our current lens of genetic race, we'll say things like, oh, African Americans are predisposed to diabetes and they're predisposed to high blood pressure. But if we go by what the science says, which is that there is no genetic race, then we begin to understand that the environments that create stress are the drivers for poor health outcomes as well. And then the Rise Center, which is a group out of California that began to study historical trauma and put interventions in place, were able to think through the different dynamics of historical trauma, and they extended this initial pyramid that was done in the 90s. What they added was that historical trauma, the trauma that has happened to you even before, the trauma that has happened to your ancestors even before you were born, make it more likely for you to experience trauma in present day. It also talks about where you're born, which is the green area above that says local context. So the zip code that I'm born in can make it more likely for me to experience trauma. Again, things that are going on before I'm even born. So historical trauma, depending on if I'm born Black or brown, and then local context, depending on what neighborhood I'm born into, what neighborhood my parents live in, will make it more likely for me to experience complex trauma, making it more likely for me to experience early death. They go on to add some other distinctions. So right above the complex trauma, the blue area is a peach area that talks about allostatic load. Allostatic load is the low-level stress that people of color endure all the time. I would also say that women also endure allostatic load, especially being fearful of their environments. or being on alert of their environments all the time. This is something that people of color also experience, the low-level stress of racism and discrimination that they experience all the time. Allostatic load has a kind of wear and tear type of effect on your DNA, making it, again, that drives that early death, but also drives mental health issues, which are more prevalent in people of color, and especially women of color. And so allostatic load is another factor in that social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Also, another distinction that is made when it comes to disease, disability, and social problems is the distinction of criminalization and stigmatization. So the mental health issues in people of color are often criminalized or stigmatized. To put it within context, children of color living in dangerous neighborhoods who are obviously experiencing PTSD are being labeled as thugs or criminals for their obvious external behaviors that reflect PTSD. So who gets the luxury of being seen as someone in need of care? And who gets the label of being seen as someone that's difficult or has a culture of criminality? And again, ultimately, these things lead to early death. And there's lots of drivers to this, because one of the things that's not really talked about here is epigenetics, and so how our environment impacts our DNA. This phenomenon is known as intergenerational transmission of trauma that we have known about since the 60s. Studies that were done in the 1960s that found that trauma could be passed on through generations and look like PTSD-like symptoms. The studies were initially done on Holocaust survivors and their children, and they found that their children displayed PTSD-like symptoms even though they had not experienced the Holocaust themselves. They also reported that their parents were damaged and preoccupied. And so this is not something that we have not been aware of for quite some time. And this is passed on in two main ways. First, we have parenting. So even if we think about parenting in terms of the field of architecture, are parents pushing their children into the arts? Do parents of color see architecture as a realistic avenue for them to pursue? Do people of color see themselves with mentors or represented in the field? This is problematic, and this is a mechanism of parenting. But there's other mechanisms as well. Epigenetics is a big one because it impacts cognitive ability, which is going to impact the grades, the ability to focus, and obviously the ability to matriculate through school settings. And so this intergenerational transmission is one of the most prevalent ways that inequity is transferred through generations. And so being born in this society in America with brown skin, or the gender that or the sex that you're born with, these things will impact how you are treated, how you are raised, and ultimately will have an impact on your life trajectory, your health and well-being. And then, like I said before, when it comes to epigenetic changes, this has also been proven, at least since the 80s, that trauma and stress impacts your genetic material and how it's expressed. So when it comes to trauma and stress in these more hostile environments, so thinking about the hostile environment of slavery, the hostile environment of Jim Crow, the hostile environment of being displaced for Indigenous people, the Trail of Tears. This would be something that would be ongoing stress that would impact your genetic material and how it's expressed. And when it comes to stress and trauma, that looks like cognitive impairment, mental health disorders, and chronic disease. And so what we're talking about here is racial trauma, that discrimination, microaggressions, these things have caused racial trauma in our space, especially America, because we're so race focused. It is more likely to happen in Black and Indigenous peoples as well as Latino communities. It is considered a mental injury that has a psychological impact. So the inability to sleep, mental health disorders that are based around stress, higher likelihood of depression, and of course the physical issues like diabetes, high blood pressure, and things of that nature. They can be direct, like microaggressions at work, or not getting a promotion that you're very qualified for, then you believe that it's due to skin color. And obviously, very direct racist attacks like being called a racial slur. They can also be vicarious, like last year in May when George Floyd was murdered, and people were able to watch the video, and they were traumatized by the video, even though they had not experienced it themselves. That's a vicarious traumatic stressor. And that video obviously traumatized many people, not just Black people, but it was ultimately very traumatic for Black people because they connected with race, especially Black men and boys who connected with both race and gender. One thing about vicarious, it is also reflected in the environment. So, and that's something to think about when it comes to architecture specifically. The environment of your neighborhood can be a reflection of vicarious trauma. That as you see what your neighborhood looks like as compared to others, as you see people in your neighborhood who all have the same racial characteristics as you do, this can lead to what we call vicarious trauma. And then last, we have transmitted stressors, which is what we've been talking about today. This is an issue of how stress and trauma is transmitted throughout generations. And so historical trauma is what we're talking about here when we talk about specific groups. So this term was coined in the 1980s by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She defined it as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations that emanates from a massive group trauma and is also accompanied by historical unresolved grief. And so this type of trauma is extremely impactful. It changes the way that we see the world. It changes the way that we raise our children. It changes the way that we see others. And this is extremely pervasive. Also, when I talk about historical trauma, we tend to talk about it when it comes to people of color. However, white people have also experienced historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And it is reflected in the way that we have a continued issue around a lack of empathy for people of color, a continued issue of seeing people of color as a threat. This also stems from intergenerational transmission. If we think about what white parents would have told their children about the reasons why they were driving Indigenous peoples off their land, what white parents would have told their children when they attended lynchings of Black people, they would have told them that those people were the enemy, that they were other, that they were not like them, that they were not human or less than in order to justify their actions. And so this is also passed down through generations. So seeing Black people and Indigenous people as a threat is also a historical trauma that is passed on through generations and still reflected in the way that we live today. When we think about historically traumatic events, we have slavery, obviously a genocide, but you'll see lots of different things. So stripping of cultural identity and practices. This is especially relevant for architecture. How different cultures are represented through architecture. Most architecture is European, and even regardless of the neighborhood that it's in, it's still European design. It is a reflection of white supremacy that is even embedded within Black and Brown communities. And you can read through these for yourself, but some thing that I want to point out for sure is that pandemics and natural disasters are considered historically traumatic. And so we are in the midst of a collective trauma right now that could become a historically traumatic event. And then groups most impacted, Indigenous, African Americans, people living in poverty, especially generational poverty, refugees. I would also include LGBTQI individuals, but for a different reason. Typically, this ties to genetics, but however, they have a history of oppression and exclusion in our nation, so that I would include them on this list as well. And the symptoms we're all aware of. So the things that I outlined before: increased violence, issues of mental health and substance use, poverty, lack of educational attainment, higher crime rates. Things that are most impactful, think about unemployment, lower IQ. And so these are obviously one side of the coin when it comes to how people of color are kind of excluded from these more what we consider elite industries because of this impact of historical trauma. But on the flip side, there is also the beliefs and values that people hold about these groups. So regardless of they're impacted or not, they're still stereotypically seen in these ways because of how historical trauma goes hand in hand with institutional racism. In other words, blaming the victim. And so ecology matters. What this means is that, again, racism is institutional. I don't agree with critical race theory when they say that there's no individual racism. There's also individual racism as far as I'm concerned. But institutional racism happens within layers. So at the individual layer, meaning the microaggressions at work, the microaggressions at school, the lower or higher expectations based on your race in work and school, how your parents raise you. But then there's also this community level, what your neighborhood looks like in comparison to others, community violence, what does your school look like, how is it funded, or how well is it funded? Do you have access to quality education? Then another layer of the policies that are impacting you, like mass incarceration, over surveillance, and over policing, media depiction of you, how you see yourself reflected back in the media. And then even the macro system, which is how, the beliefs and values that we have around race in this country, how that drives the way that we see each other, and the way that we see ourselves as well. So it can become an issue of how we have internalized racism as well. And so this means that anything that we do to address racism has to also has that layer those layers of impact. So the RISE Center has done a great job of adapting that first visual, which was Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model. This is the RISE Center's kind of response to that, but looking specifically at trauma and healing. So for you, it's going to be on your left side, we have the dehumanization and distress, where it outlines on those different levels how stress and trauma are being, how they're being manifest in these different spaces. So on the individual level, people are experiencing more trauma because of their skin color or their gender. They're experiencing more bullying. They have more family system stressors like poverty, domestic violence. They have that intergenerational transmission, so the historical trauma that's impacting their parents' ability to parent. And then the next level up in the community in place is the atmospheric distress. So if you are a person of color in America, you're more likely to have an exposure to community violence. You're more likely to be sexually exploited. You're more likely to have a lack of safe passage. So can you get to the school bus safely? Is it safe to walk on your streets at night? You have underinvestment, so issues of gentrification and high rent and things of this nature. You have over surveillance, so issues of police brutality, the higher likelihood of being, having a charge because you have over surveillance because the police are just in your neighborhood. And then, of course, you have like the community violence and the lateral violence and kind of the interpersonal and family violence. And then when we go up to the institutional level, systems and institutions, this is where we have the systemic subjugation of people of color historically. This is where the war on drug lies. This is where mass incarceration lies. So if we think about how people are not able to engage in higher education because they have a drug charge from marijuana at 16, even though they're in a group that is least likely to use drugs. And this is because of over surveillance and these kind of systemic issues that are impacting them. Anti-immigrant policies, climate violence, so being more likely to live in an area where you will experience exposure to pollution, redlining, which means that your past policies of redlining have made it so that you can only live in a certain area, you can only afford a certain area. And this has created lots of issues that then trickle down into that community level. Then we have nation building, which is what we're really talking about today. This is historical trauma. This is the higher level and the beliefs and understanding that we have in this country. We have a core belief that people of color are meant to be exploited, that it's okay to pay them less money, that it's okay to not promote them, that it's okay to exploit them economically. It's okay to expect unpaid labor from them. That it's okay for them to change their culture to speak English, to change their culture to be more European or Eurocentric. It's okay to, displace them for their land. And it's okay to expect them to assimilate to what we would call American culture, which is what we would call cultural hegemony, and ultimately white supremacy. That there is, one way to do things the right way, and that is white. So white supremacy and groups that are not white are expected to assimilate, to speak English, to have a white aesthetic, to be lighter skinned, to have straighter hair, to dress to a European standard, and basically let go or be stripped of their cultural identity. So these are the issues that are impacting people of color and causing them that allostatic load from the day to day. So when we look at this for the field of architecture, there's all of these systems are at play. obviously. When we think about the individuals, especially in workplaces and schools, are we having one-on-one interactions with people of color that honor their resilience and fortitude, or are we interacting with them in ways that have microaggressions and discrimination? In the community in place, are we creating visually, aesthetically pleasing spaces for them in their neighborhoods? Are all of the buildings that we have a European aesthetic? Do we have places for them that are beautiful in their space? Do we create healing spaces for them? Do we celebrate them in our work? And then, of course, at the institutional level, do we create policies that power share? Do we make sure that we have equitable policies that ensure that we are righting past wrongs in our current situations? Are we healing centered in our norms and in our procedures? Are we power sharing? In the work that we do to attempt to right past wrongs, are they included in that work? Or are we just assuming that we know the problems? So there is nothing about us without us. So if we have committees that are focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, is everybody on the committee white? And then if you are, then how would you be able to really affect change when you might be disconnected from the issues? And then at the highest level is, are we changing the way that we see this American life? Are we still buying into American exceptionalism? Are we still believing that it's okay for us to treat other people poorly based on skin color? Are we okay with reparations? Are we okay with telling the truth of the past? And so this is a great visual for thinking through what it means and where you lie in how you can be liberating and healing, not just for people of color, but for our nation as a whole. We are, because of our racist past, we are unable to be innovative and move forward. We are still being hindered by this racist past and for several reasons, but mostly for our inability to admit that we have a racist past. And then our inability to effectively address it. So we don't want to give reparations. We don't want to pay people of color more money. We don't want to take a smaller piece of pie and give someone else a bigger piece of pie. So our inability to do that, or what we would call, reconciliation, is preventing us from being things like before, like number one in education, the best place on earth, the melting pot that we say that we are. All of that is being hindered by our inability to address racism. And so the cure for this is really trauma-informed practices. So if the root cause for our issues is trauma, historically, collectively around race, that means trauma-informed practices is helpful for us to move forward. For the workplace and for academia, it's going to look like, making sure that our systems, our programs, our organizations realize the widespread impact of trauma, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, and respond in a way that obviously does not re-traumatize people. So this is what we call the 4 R's. Other things to think about when it comes to trauma-informed practices is that they are in different, there's key principles in different realms or different, spheres of influence. So the first are the 6 principles: safety, not just physical safety, but psychological safety. Trustworthiness and transparency. What we're doing is kind of an operation in transparency. Maybe not trustworthiness, that might be, we'll see how that goes, but definitely transparency, which is our field has a problem. We recognize that our statistics don't look good. How do we address it? So that transparency is there. Now, the next thing is, trustworthiness. Are you going to actually do what you say you're going to do? Are you going to follow through? Peer support, so that as you are moving through the trauma-informed practice and the trauma-informed approach, that you have, you're not working in silos, that you're working together, that you're holding each other accountable. Collaboration and mutuality. The mutual benefits of this need to be clear. You need to collaborate across sectors. And some of this we're doing in this series, so we have both academic and workplace represented, so that we, this is how we're going to tackle this issue. We can't just do it in academia and then send the students out into the real world and they get to the firms and are treated very differently. Also, if we were really being multi-sector, we would bring in other levels of education. We would definitely bring in funders. We would educate sponsors and mentors. All of the different stakeholders would be on board. Empowerment, voice, and choice. So empowering people of color and women in the space. And then, of course, cultural, historical, and gender issues, making sure that you are not ignoring them, which has been kind of the status quo in America ever since the civil rights movement. It's been, well, we can't talk about people like we used to in the past. We can't treat people like we used to in the past in an overt way. So now we're going to switch to covert. We're just not going to talk about it and still do the same things. This is saying that we bring this to the forefront, that we talk about differences in culture, we talk about our history, we talk about gender issues, and that they are part of that transparency that we, that's in number 2. And then when it comes to the domains or realms that we want to focus on, it can't be in just one section. We have to look at it multidimensional. So your leadership needs to be on board. Your policies need to reflect trauma-informed practice. Your physical environment, which is going to be very much an issue in architecture, needs to reflect trauma-informed practices. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Your engagement, the cross-sector collaboration. So again, everybody's on board, all stakeholders. And then also, progress in screening and assessment. Is it working? Are the things that you're doing working? You need to do pre-test and post-test. You need to monitor progress, and you also need to be able to pivot so that intervention, the thing that you put in place that cost a lot of money, it's not working. Are you going to just keep going forward and keep spending the money and it not work? You need to be adaptive and flexible. Obviously, you need to train and engage in workforce development. You need to have funders that are on board. You need to think about where you're going to put your money that reflects equity. And then you also need to just be continuously evaluating your efforts and your work. So when we talk about the physical environment, we go back to this. How does your work lean in on the liberation and healing side? How does your individual interactions, the policies you put in place, the work that you do, the buildings and the built environment that you create, all of that, your beliefs and values, how is it contributing to liberation and healing? This visual helps a lot. And then when we think about trauma-informed practices in the physical environment itself, that's going to be what we call trauma-informed design. So the layout, furniture, visual and oral interest, light and color, art, biophilic design, all of these are healing for human beings and others. And so, is this type of work only for spaces where there's people who are well off or rich or privileged or advantaged? Do we provide these spaces in places where there are people living in poverty, or there's people who are majority people of color. If we look at equity, we would put these kind of spaces in those areas of people that are underserved. And so that concludes my presentation, but now I want to shift to discussions and any questions that may have come up, and also just any reflections on what I've presented today as it pertains to your field and your work. So I definitely ask people to turn their cameras on and feel free to, I want to be able to see everyone's faces instead of kind of talking into the void, and I will stop sharing. Ashley, do we have any questions in the chat? And
well, I had one and I posted it in there and you hit some topics, but I said, how can one implement culturally responsive strategies when working with individuals who have experienced historical or racial trauma? And then I said that was a great graphic that you showed. It was, with the circles. And so anyway, that was my question. You did answer it, but if you have any other suggestions, particularly, I guess for my, I guess personally, it would be just friends, right? Or for individuals on our call, it could be for firms as well. So
yeah, especially for firms, you have the ability to bring in like focus groups to think through what that looks like in real life. And so I would suggest that, and that's kind of, a part of that nothing about us without us. If you're not sure, then it's always good to go to the group that you want information from, pay them to come in and consult with you, just like you pay anyone else. And then they can help you to make those decisions and gather research and ask those questions. Definitely you want to, you want to take into account the groups that you're serving on a wide scale. So it's also about neighborhoods and cities, so if you're doing a lot of work in Memphis is somewhat of a chocolate city, then you have to really think about what is an African-American aesthetic. So it's just more about, there's some basic things that you might just be overlooking because we have this white-centered approach to everything. But then also you can bring in people and ask them. For the most part, they're very willing to give you feedback, probably for free. But then that equity issue comes in. You should pay them for their voice.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? I mean, the chat's kind of quiet, so if you want to unmute and feel free to talk to Ingrid, go for it.
Yeah, and going off what Ingrid just said, I think a lot of it, and especially if we're doing community projects, a lot of it's required in the contracts for us to have community meetings with the stakeholders and asking them early in the process rather than just, here's the pretty pictures, tell us you like it. So really having those stakeholder meetings early in the process and continually through the process to get feedback and actually listen to the feedback that you're getting.
Ingrid, do you have any suggestions for folks who are trying to do engagement but are finding a problem of kind of just lack of participation because people feel that this is just another opportunity for me to be ignored? I've come to these meetings over and over again, and all of my information I haven't seen come to fruition within the built environment. So do you have any suggestions about dealing with that?
So one thing that has worked in other fields is, I know I said it very flippantly about paying people, but Vanderbilt does a good job of this. I'm also a consultant for Vanderbilt Medical Center, and they have this same issue when they're trying to get community feedback around how they care for the community. And so then they began to consider the people that we're bringing in as consultants. And they would pay them sometimes small amounts, like $50 to come in and talk. And then sometimes it would be more depending on what they needed. But they were considered partners. It was a different type of relationship. And then people feel less likely to feel exploited when you treat them in this way. And again, you would probably pay someone to do that anyway, who is not as connected to the issue that you want to address. And that is also a reflection of the value that we have around this issue. So, treat them as consultants. Lived experience is a skill set.
Ingrid, I thought the point that you made when you said environments that create stress are the drivers for poor health outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about another point where a building it's not just good enough for its given use. I don't know that I have a question, but just a point. I serve on the board of Renewal House here in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And that's a facility that treats women with addictions and their children. And they have a new building under construction because they provide housing for these women. And being on that board, one of the things that actually the board recognized, and I was kind of surprised, but they recognized that the building shouldn't just be a building that just serves that purpose, but that it should also inspire hope and healing and be a beautiful building. And I think sometimes, that's overlooked. We tend to think about it's good enough for this group, or it's good enough for this purpose. And I think it's incumbent, in support of what you said, upon all of us to think beyond that, because as architects, we know, the power of our environment and the power of our buildings. So just wanted to say, I thought that was a really good point, and it made me think.
Yeah, and that is, it's very clear about where we think beauty belongs when we look around our neighborhoods and our cities, and so who deserves to get beauty and who doesn't, who gets the care around details and things of that nature, and who doesn't. And so it is an equity issue, obviously. I mean, it's obviously an issue of equality. It's not equal as well. But then it's also an equity issue because it tends to come down to money, right? We can't afford to put this type of artistry in this neighborhood. But equity would say that we owe this type of artistry to this neighborhood, historically and currently. And this is especially important for places like Renewal House that are already working with people who are have experienced stress and trauma, but then historically traumatized groups and those that are vulnerable. So I put up a list of people who are vulnerable to historical trauma, and it included children. So parks, schools, because they're a vulnerable group, we want to make sure that we are adding a buffer in their built environment against stress and trauma that they may experience. LGBTQI children, like that intersectionality. We have to think about those groups who are historically traumatized and healing them through our artistry and what that would look like, whether it's on a budget or not.
There's another question in the chat. It says the architecture industry has a real diversity problem in America, with only a tiny percentage of licensed architects being Black, for example. Do you know of strategies that other industries have used to successfully change this dynamic?
So strategies that work in the short term, we're getting good at. And so, we're pretty good at tokenism. So we can hire more Black and brown people. That might not be difficult, right? We tend to say, oh, there's not enough because of, but there's ways to bring in more. Then the question is, can you keep them? Because retention is a problem, and retention is a problem because of racism. So you hire them, you bring them in as tokens to meet quotas to show more diversity, but then you're not inclusive and you're not equitable. So you bring them in and they can't really afford the things that they need to be a good architect. They don't have sponsorship. You bring them in and they're experiencing microaggressions because they're the only person there that looks like them. Or you bring them in and everyone's really nice, but their opinions and their perspective is not valued. And so in the short term, it's going to be things like pipelines to bring more people into the field through education. I think that would need to start as early as possible. So elementary schools would be if the earliest you can start will be better, so that the children can see themselves in the role. Because often when we aspire to what we're going to do later in life, it happens in your childhood. Obviously, partnerships with colleges and universities. But then we need to get into the logistics of it. So people need sponsors, people need mentors, they need people that are invested in their success. They need to see themselves in the role. Their perspectives need to be honored and valued. And so that is what's going to get you to retention, so that once they're there, they're more likely to stay. And you need to pay them in a way that reflects equity. And that's been a continuous hurdle for all industries. So no one has the answer to that. Typically, people of color and women get paid less than men, especially white men. So this is an issue of, value, that it's acceptable to pay people less if they're not white or if they're not male. And then on top of that, there is, again, this expectation that even though I'm paying you less, even though you might be valued, that you should also be grateful that you're here, kind of thing. And this leads to a lack of retention. Any other questions? And I tend to, I want to definitely make a disclaimer that you don't have to have perfect language to ask the question. This is a safe space, so I always forget to say that, but you don't have to have perfect language to ask the question. Not easily offended.
I want to say thank you, Ingrid. This was wonderful. It was a great addition to what we talked about last year, and a great reminder and a great refresher for those of us who were here last year. And for those new folks, I think it was a really good introduction into what we're talking about and where we're trying to go as a profession, especially at AIA Tennessee. So thank you so very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So if we don't have any other questions or comments, the only thing that I will end with is, again, just that it's self-examination. So like when I started on white identity and the construct of race, that so much of the work that needs to be done it really needs to be focused on not the logistics of how it gets done, but also changing our values and understanding of race. And understanding that, I talked a lot about deficit focused, for people of color, but there's also historical trauma and intergenerational transmission for white people that you have to work on, especially as we're getting into the holidays, when you go home for Thanksgiving, those conversations with other family members. Those kinds of things have been passed along through generations, and you are not immune to historical trauma, just like people of color aren't immune to historical trauma. Those types of issues, shade your thinking, create bias. And even though you might not be aware of bias or lack of empathy, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And so that's going to be where the most work is done. People of color are resilient. Women are resilient. And so they are thriving despite these issues. So when we think about what the work really is, it's going to be that white people take ownership of the issue and address it, as opposed to what we can think of to help people of color thrive. Those are two separate issues.
I'd like to just share this book with everyone. If you need some encouragement that that it's happening, that people are addressing all sorts of different issues in the built environment, this is the book, Expanding Architecture, Design as Activism. And it's honest about some of the problems that people face, and it's honest about the work that people are doing all over the world to address all types of different situations. And it just has great information in it. So it's a lot of different essays of projects that have come to fruition. So just wanted to share that. Thank you, Ingrid. I haven't seen your presentation yet because I was in a board meeting, but I can hardly wait to watch the recording. I remember from last year how amazing everything you said was. So looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have questions?
Ingrid, that was excellent. It's just really eye-opening. It was excellent, and look forward to tomorrow and the next day as well.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you guys for having me again.
Thanks, everyone. And don't forget to put your name and your member number for CE reporting that. And we'll also be posting our talks later on our website. If you haven't had a chance to go back to view the talks from 2020, feel free to. They're on the website, and we'll send out an update so you can take a look at those. Well, if there's no other questions, then we will see everyone tomorrow at 11 Central, noon Eastern. Thanks, Ingrid.
Bye.